The great chamber of the Galactic Council had never been so quiet. For 300 years, this room had seen countless negotiations, treaties, and agreements between the most powerful species in the known universe. The walls stretched upward for hundreds of feet, covered in glowing symbols that represented each member species. Floating platforms held delegates from 47 different civilizations, all of them watching the scene unfolding below with growing unease. High Arbiter of the Dominion stood at the central podium, his four eyes blinking one after another as he tried to process what he had just heard. His gray-green skin had turned slightly pale, a sign of stress that his species rarely showed in public. He was the most powerful being in the galaxy, the leader of the council that had maintained order for centuries. No one had ever spoken to him the way this human woman had just spoken. Ambassador stood in the center of the circular chamber floor, her feet planted firmly on the polished stone. She was not tall by human standards, but she carried herself like someone much larger. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style, and she wore the formal blue uniform of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. Behind her stood Admiral Chris, a man with silver hair and hard eyes who had seen more battles than most species had seen generations. The Council had summoned the humans to discuss what they called the Territorial Allocation Act. Under this act, humanity would be restricted to 12 star systems. They would pay tribute to the Council for protection. They would limit their fleet to 50 vessels, and they would accept that they were a minor species, lucky to have been discovered by the enlightened civilizations of the galaxy. Had listened to the full reading of the demands. She had remained silent while explained, in great detail, how generous the Council was being. Other species had waited thousands of years for such favorable terms. Humanity should be grateful. When finished speaking, he had expected the human ambassador to bow her head in acceptance. Perhaps she would ask for small modifications, minor adjustments that the Council could graciously grant. This was how things worked. This was how things had always worked. Instead had said a single word, no. The murmurs that followed were like a wave passing through the chamber. Delegates leaned toward each other, whispering in their own languages. Some thought they had misheard. Others thought the translation devices had malfunctioned. Surely the human had not actually refused. Raised one of his four hands to silence the chamber. His voice was calm but carried an edge of warning. He asked to repeat herself. Perhaps she had misspoken. Perhaps she did not understand the gravity of this assembly. Understood perfectly. She told that the Terran Confederation rejected the territorial allocation in its entirety. They would not accept the boundaries the Council had drawn. They would not surrender their colonies in the Sigma Reach, the Outer Verge, or any other region they had settled. They would not pay tribute to anyone, and they would not limit their fleet to satisfy the fears of species who saw humanity as a threat. The representative, a serpentine creature with scales that shifted between purple and silver, rose from her floating platform. Her voice was a soft hiss that the translation devices rendered into standard galactic speech. She reminded the chamber that every species accepted Council authority. This was how peace was maintained. This was how order was preserved. Without the Council, the galaxy would descend into chaos and war. Turned to face the directly. She said that peace maintained through submission was not peace at all. It was obedience. The Terran Confederation had not crossed the vast distances of space to become servants. They had come to take their place among the stars as equals, not as subjects. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted over each other. Some called for the humans to be expelled immediately. Others demanded military action. A few sat in stunned silence, unable to believe what they were witnessing. In 300 years, no species had ever openly the Council in this chamber. Struck the podium with his ceremonial staff, the sound echoing through the vast space. Slowly, the noise died down. The High Arbiter's four eyes focused on with an intensity that had made countless diplomats tremble and back down from their positions. He told the human ambassador that she was making a grave mistake. The Council had been patient with humanity because they were young and did not understand galactic politics, but patience had limits. If the Terran Confederation refused to accept the territorial allocation, they would face consequences: economic sanctions, trade embargoes, and if necessary, military intervention. Admiral stepped forward for the first time. He had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, but now he spoke with a voice that carried the weight of command. He told that the Terran Defense Fleet was prepared for any response the Council chose to make. They had not come to this assembly expecting friendship. They had come to deliver a message. The Admiral reached into his uniform pocket and produced a small data device. He activated it, and a holographic display appeared in the center of the chamber. It showed the current disposition of human forces throughout the galaxy: fleet positions, colony defenses, industrial capacity, weapons development programs. The numbers made several delegates gasp audibly. In 18 years of Council membership, humanity had built a military force that rivaled species who had been spacefaring for. They had colonized more worlds in 2 decades than most civilizations claimed in 1,000 years. And they had done it all while the Council assumed they were a primitive species barely worth monitoring. Deactivated the display and returned the device to his pocket. He told the assembled delegates that humanity did not want war. They wanted to explore, to build, to grow alongside other species in mutual respect. But they would not accept chains, no matter how prettily those chains were presented. Stepped forward again, drawing all attention back to herself. She told that the Terran Confederation was offering the Council a choice. They could accept humanity as an equal partner in galactic civilization. They could negotiate in good faith, respecting human sovereignty as they respected the sovereignty of every other species, or they could try to force humanity into submission. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. Then she told them what would happen if they chose force. The humans would resist. They would fight with every ship, every soldier, every resource they possessed. And they would not stop fighting until they had won or until the last human drew their final breath. The chamber was silent. Turned and walked toward the exit, Admiral falling into step beside her. At the doorway, she paused and looked back at the assembled delegates. She told them that the Council had one standard month to make their decision. After that, the Terran Confederation would consider negotiations concluded. They would act according to their own interests, without regard for Council mandates or territorial allocations. Then she walked out, leaving the most powerful beings in the galaxy staring after her in stunned disbelief. For the first time in 3 centuries, the Galactic Council had encountered something they did not know how to handle. They had encountered a species that refused to be afraid. The inner circle chamber was hidden deep within the Council complex, accessible only to the 7 most powerful species in the galaxy. No recording devices were permitted. No aides or assistants were allowed. What happened in this room stayed in this room, and for 300 years, the decisions made here had shaped the fate of civilizations. High Arbiter sat at the head of the circular table, his 4 eyes studying each of his fellow leaders in turn. To his left sat Archminister Eth of the Collective, her crystalline body pulsing with agitated blue light. Beside her was Intelligence Director of the Empire, a tall being with dark purple skin and eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The other 4 seats held the leaders of the Consortium, the Hierarchy, the Federation, and the Ancient of the Dominion. These 7 species had ruled the galaxy together since the founding of the Council. They had crushed rebellions, absorbed rival powers, and maintained an order that benefited themselves above all others. They had never failed to bring a defiant species to heel. Until now. Eth spoke first, her voice carrying the harmonic resonance of her crystalline form. She demanded to know how this was possible. The humans had been spacefaring for barely 2 centuries. There was a small planet orbiting an unremarkable star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. By every projection, every model, every historical precedent, they should have remained a minor power for at least another 1,000 years. Activated the display system built into the table. Holographic images appeared above the surface, showing detailed intelligence reports that his operatives had gathered over the past 18 years. The data was disturbing on every level. He began with the basics. Human reproduction rates were among the highest of any known species. Where other civilizations measured population growth in centuries, humans measured it in decades. A single generation for the represented 4 or 5 generations for humanity. This meant they could colonize worlds faster, build infrastructure faster, and recover from losses faster than anyone had anticipated. But that was only the beginning. Showed them data on human adaptability. Most species could only survive in a narrow range of environmental conditions. Humans had been found thriving on frozen worlds, desert planets, high-gravity moons, and stations orbiting gas giants. They modified their bodies, their technology, and their behavior to fit whatever environment they encountered. Where other species saw obstacles, humans saw challenges to overcome. The military data was even more alarming. When humanity first made contact with the galaxy, their fleet consisted of 12 vessels, primitive ships with basic weapons and limited range. The Council had assigned them a threat level of 2 on a scale of 100, nothing to worry about. Now, 18 years later, the Terran Defense Fleet numbered over 200 warships. They had developed weapons that could penetrate shields. They had engines that could match speed. Their tactics were unpredictable, creative, and devastatingly effective in simulations. Analysts had revised their threat assessment upward 17 times in the past decade. The current rating was 63 and climbing. The ancient beyond measure spoke in a voice like grinding stone. He asked what the humans wanted. Surely they could be bought off with concessions. Territory, trade rights, seats on minor committees. Every species had a price. Shook his head slowly. He told the assembled leaders that his agents had spent years trying to find leverage against humanity. They had looked for weaknesses, divisions, factions that could be exploited. What they found instead was a species united by something they called spite. He explained the concept as best he could. When humans were told they could not do something, their first instinct was to prove otherwise. When they were threatened, they did not retreat. They prepared. When they were dismissed as inferior, they remembered, and they built, and they waited. The Terran Confederation had spent 18 years preparing for exactly this confrontation. They had known from the beginning that the Council would never accept them as equals willingly, so they had made themselves impossible to ignore. Asked about diplomatic solutions, perhaps they could offer the humans better terms than the original mandate. More systems, fewer restrictions, a faster path to full membership. Surely some compromise could be reached. The representative, a being of flowing liquid metal that constantly shifted shape, gurgled a response. He had spoken with human traders and merchants over the years. He told the others that humans had a saying, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me." They did not trust the Council. They believed that any concession offered now would be taken back later once the immediate crisis had passed. And the worst part, they continued, was that humans were probably right. The Council had broken promises before. They had offered favorable terms to rebellious species, only to slowly tighten control once the threat had passed. It was standard practice. Everyone at this table had approved such measures dozens of times. Eth pulsed with frustrated light. She suggested economic pressure, cut off human access to galactic trade networks, embargo their goods, freeze their accounts. Without commerce, their economy would collapse within a decade. Pulled up more data. He showed them reports of human merchant ships appearing in non-council space. The frontier regions, the independent worlds, the species too small or too remote to warrant council attention. The humans were building their own trade network, offering better terms than the council monopolies provided. Several minor species had already signed exclusive agreements with Terran merchants. Furthermore, human industrial capacity was approaching self-sufficiency. They had been stockpiling resources, building factories, developing domestic alternatives to galactic imports. His analysts estimated that humanity could survive total economic isolation for at least 30 years without significant hardship. By that time, their alternative trade networks would be fully established. The representative, a feathered being with large golden eyes, spoke softly. She observed that the humans had been planning this for a very long time, perhaps since first contact. They had smiled and nodded and accepted every restriction, all while preparing for the day they would throw off those restrictions entirely. Felt something he had not experienced in centuries: uncertainty. The Council had faced rebellions before, but those had been desperate acts by species with no other options. The humans were not desperate. They were calculated. They had chosen this moment deliberately when they were strong enough to resist, but before the Council recognized the full extent of their power. He asked the question that no one wanted to answer. What if they simply attacked now, with everything they had? Surely the combined fleets of the Council could overwhelm 200 human ships, no matter how advanced. Was silent for a long moment. Then he told them the truth. Yes, they could probably defeat the current human fleet, but the cost would be enormous. His projections showed losses of 40 to 60% of the attacking force, and that assumed the humans would fight a conventional battle, which his analysts doubted. More importantly, destroying the fleet would not end the war. The humans would retreat to their colonies, dig in, and rebuild. They would wage guerrilla campaigns, strike at supply lines, attack vulnerable worlds. The war would drag on for decades, draining Council resources and destabilizing the entire galactic order. And worst of all, concluded, other species would see the Council struggle against a species that had been spacefaring for only 2 centuries. The illusion of invincible power that kept 100 civilizations obedient would be shattered. Rebellions would spread. The entire system that the Inner Circle had built over 300 years could collapse. The chamber fell into heavy silence. For the first time in living memory, the rulers of the galaxy had no good options. The humans had seen to that. The Sigma Reach was a cluster of 12 star systems on the edge of Council-controlled space. Rich in resources and strategically important, it had been marked for allocation to the Dominion under the new territorial mandate. The only problem was that humanity had already colonized 3 of those systems, with populations numbering in the millions. 6 months after Ambassador's rejection of Council terms, a peacekeeping fleet was dispatched to enforce the mandate. 47 warships from 5 different species jumped into the outer reaches of the Sigma Reach, expecting to find token human resistance at best. Scout reports had indicated only light defensive presence. The operation was expected to last 3 days. Admiral N of the Navy commanded the fleet from his dreadnought, a massive vessel that dwarfed everything else in his formation. He was a veteran of 17 pacification campaigns, and he had never lost. The humans were brave, he admitted privately, but bravery meant nothing against superior numbers and firepower. His confidence lasted approximately 4 minutes after arrival. The first warning came from his sensor officer, a young who had never seen actual combat. The officer reported contacts emerging from behind the 4th planet. Many contacts. The number kept climbing as the sensors struggled to track them all. Admiral Chris had been waiting for this moment. The 2nd Terran Expeditionary Fleet had been positioned in the shadow of the gas giant for 3 weeks, running silent, invisible to long-range scans. 23 warships in total, less than half the Council force. But they had advantages that numbers alone could not measure. Commander Lisa Park stood at the tactical station aboard the carrier Defiant, watching the enemy fleet spread out in standard Council formation. She had studied that formation for years. She knew its strengths, its weaknesses, and exactly how to exploit both. The Council ships were arranged in a layered defense, with the heavy dreadnoughts at the center and lighter vessels forming a protective screen. It was a formation designed for fleet battles against similar opponents. It assumed the enemy would approach head-on, engage at range, and try to break through to the command ships. The humans had no intention of doing any of those things. Opened communications with the Council flagship. His face appeared on Admiral N's display, calm and untroubled despite being outnumbered 2-1. He told the commander that he had entered Terran sovereign space. He suggested that the peacekeeping fleet turn around and go home. N almost laughed. He told that under Galactic Council Mandate 7712, the Sigma Reach was designated territory. The human presence was illegal. They had 1 hour to begin evacuation of their colonies, or the peacekeeping fleet would commence enforcement operations. Did not argue, he did not negotiate, he simply said no. The word hung in the void between the two fleets. N felt his confidence waver slightly. He had expected the human admiral to bluster, to threaten, to demand better terms. Instead, just sat there, waiting, as if he knew something N did not. The hour passed in tense silence. Both fleets held position, weapons powered but not yet locked on targets. N consulted with his fellow commanders, representatives from the and contingents. They agreed that the humans were bluffing. No rational species would fight against such odds. N ordered his fleet to advance. The formation began moving toward the human positions, maintaining careful spacing and overlapping fields of fire. Standard protocol, overwhelming force. The humans would see the approaching armada and realize their position was hopeless. The Defiant did not move. None of the human ships moved. They sat in perfect stillness as the Council fleet closed the distance. At 300,000 kilometers, N demanded surrender. The human fleet was surrounded and outnumbered. There was no shame in accepting reality. His response was to cut the communication channel. At 200,000 kilometers, the Council fleet entered optimal weapons range. N prepared to give the order to fire warning shots across the human formation. One last chance for the humans to see reason. He never got the chance. The orbital defense platforms activated without warning. Hidden among the asteroid fields and debris that surrounded the human colonies, they had been invisible to Council sensors. 47 automated weapon stations, each equipped with the latest Terran military technology. They opened fire simultaneously. The Council formation dissolved into chaos. Ships that had been holding perfect position suddenly broke apart as captains tried to evade the unexpected attack. The layered defense became a disorganized mess as vessels collided with each other, blocked their own firing solutions, and lost sight of the actual enemy. And then the human fleet moved. Lisa Park had programmed the attack sequence months in advance. Each Terran ship knew exactly where to go, exactly when to fire, exactly which enemy vessel to target. They sliced into the confused Council formation like a blade, striking at the gaps that the defensive platforms had created. The Defiant led the charge, her weapons systems hammering the nearest cruiser. Human ships were smaller than their Council counterparts, but they were faster and more maneuverable. They danced between the larger vessels, staying inside the minimum range of the heavy weapons that could have destroyed them. N screamed orders that no one followed. His fleet was a coalition, crews from 5 different species who had never trained together. They spoke different languages, followed different protocols, and trusted each other not at all. The humans had known this. They had counted on it. 3 Council ships were destroyed in the first 10 minutes. 7 more were damaged badly enough to withdraw from combat. The contingent, seeing the devastation around them, broke formation and fled toward the system's edge. Their departure left a gap that the humans immediately exploited. Admiral stood on his bridge, watching the battle unfold exactly as he had planned. His voice remained calm as he issued orders, redirecting ships, adjusting targeting priorities, exploiting every mistake the Council fleet made. After 2 hours of fighting, N faced a terrible choice. He had lost 12 ships, with another 15 too damaged to continue. The humans had lost only 4 vessels. His remaining forces were scattered, demoralized, and running low on ammunition. He could continue the fight and probably destroy the human fleet eventually, but the cost would be catastrophic. He thought about the reports he had read before the mission. The humans did not surrender. They did not retreat. If he pushed them into a corner, they would fight to the death, taking as many Council ships with them as possible. And there would be consequences beyond this battle. The Sigma Reach colonies had millions of inhabitants. If the fighting spread to those worlds, the casualties would be enormous. The Council would be seen as the aggressor, slaughtering civilians to enforce a territorial mandate that most species considered unjust anyway. N gave the order to withdraw. His fleet limped out of the Sigma Reach, leaving behind the wreckage of their defeat. Admiral did not pursue. He had made his point. The humans were not to be trifled with. News of the battle spread across the galaxy within days. For the first time in 300 years, a Council peacekeeping force had been defeated. The illusion of invincibility that had kept countless species obedient had been shattered. The humans had not just won a battle, they had changed everything. The defeat at Sigma Reach sent waves through the galactic community that the Council could not contain. Within weeks, species that had quietly accepted Council authority for centuries began to ask uncomfortable questions. If the humans could resist, why not others? If the peacekeeping fleets could be defeated, what else might be possible? The Federation was the first to make a move. They had been Council members for 800 years, a feathered species known for their art, their philosophy, and their careful neutrality in galactic politics. They had never caused trouble. They had never questioned their place in the order of things. 3 weeks after the battle, a diplomatic vessel arrived at the human colony world of New Boston. Ambassador met them personally, curious about what had prompted this unprecedented visit. The envoy was named, an older member of his species with golden feathers that had begun to fade with age. He told that his people had been watching the humans with great interest. They admired what the Terran Confederation had accomplished. More importantly, they wanted to discuss possibilities. Invited him to continue. Explained that they had always valued their independence, even under Council membership. They had maintained their own culture, their own traditions, their own way of doing things. But the Council had been tightening its grip in recent centuries. Trade restrictions, cultural mandates, educational requirements. The way of life was slowly being eroded, replaced by a homogenized galactic standard. They had accepted these changes because resistance seemed impossible. The Council was too powerful, better to bend than to break. But now things were different. The humans had shown that resistance was not only possible, but could succeed. They wanted to know if the Terran Confederation would be interested in a formal alliance. Studied the elderly envoy carefully. She asked what they could offer in return. The Terran Confederation was not interested in collecting dependent species who expected humans to fight their battles for them. Had expected this question. He told that they controlled some of the most important trade routes in the galactic core. Their merchant fleets carried goods that every species needed. If they redirected that trade toward human-friendly networks, the economic impact would be significant. Furthermore, they had a reputation for wisdom and neutrality that could be valuable in diplomatic circles. Many species trusted them as honest brokers. An alliance with them would give the Terran Confederation legitimacy in the eyes of species who currently viewed humans as aggressive newcomers. Considered the offer for several days before responding. She told that the Terran Confederation was not interested in creating a new empire to replace the old one. They believed in genuine partnership, mutual benefit, and respect for sovereignty. If they were willing to join such an arrangement as equals, not as subjects or clients, Then they had a deal. The Terran Compact was signed 1 month later. It was not a military alliance in the traditional sense. Neither party was obligated to fight the other's wars. Instead, it was an economic and diplomatic partnership with provisions for cultural exchange, scientific cooperation, and mutual recognition of territorial rights. The clans came next. They were a warrior species from the frontier regions, too small and too aggressive to be fully integrated into council society. They had spent centuries fighting minor wars with their neighbors, never quite strong enough to expand but too fierce to be conquered. Their clan leader, a veteran named, traveled to human space personally. He told Admiral that his people had watched the battle at Sigma Reach with great interest. The humans fought well. They respected that. They proposed a military cooperation agreement. Not an alliance exactly, but a framework for joint training, technology sharing, and coordinated defense. They knew the frontier regions better than anyone. Their warriors could teach humans about conditions and threats that the Council databases did not cover. In return, they wanted access to human weapons technology. Their traditional armaments were effective but outdated. With Terran upgrades, they could finally stop being prey for larger powers. The Council watched these developments with growing alarm. Emergency sessions were called, proposals were debated, but the inner circle found itself paralyzed by internal disagreements. They wanted to launch a massive military operation to crush humanity before more species joined their coalition. They preferred economic measures. They argued for diplomatic outreach. While they argued, more species reached out to humanity. On Axiom Prime, the Council High Arbiter convened an unprecedented General Assembly. Every member species was invited to attend, not just the usual delegates but their highest leaders. He told them that the galaxy faced a crisis that required unified action. Ambassador was also invited. It was a calculated risk. The Council hoped that speaking before the full assembly would expose the weaknesses of the human position. They were still a small species, still vastly outnumbered. Perhaps reminding them of this fact would bring them back to the negotiating table on reasonable terms. Accepted the invitation. She arrived with a small delegation, including Admiral and a handful of aides. No military escort, no show of force, just a group of humans walking into the heart of Council power as if they belonged there. The Grand Forum was the largest enclosed space in the galaxy. 200 species sent representatives, filling tier after tier of seating that rose toward a domed ceiling painted with scenes of galactic history. At the center of the floor, a single platform waited for the human ambassador. Opened the session with a long speech about the importance of unity, the dangers of division, and the need for all species to work together under Council guidance. He spoke of the chaos that existed before the Council's founding, the wars that had devastated entire civilizations, the peace that had been built through careful cooperation. Then he invited the human ambassador to address the assembly. Walked to the platform with measured steps. She looked up at the hundreds of alien faces watching her, representing trillions of beings across thousands of worlds. She had prepared remarks, but standing there, she decided to speak from the heart instead. She told them that humanity had not come to the stars to conquer. They had come because exploration was in their nature. They wanted to see what was out there, to meet new peoples, to learn new things. When they first encountered the galactic community, they had been excited. They had hoped to find partners, friends, fellow travelers on the great journey of existence. Instead, they had found a system designed to keep them small, to limit their growth, to ensure they never became a threat to the established order. They had been offered a place in the galaxy, but only if they accepted permanent inferiority. The assembly shifted uncomfortably. Several delegates looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. Continued. She said that humanity understood why the Council worked the way it did. Power was comfortable. Those who had it wanted to keep it. Those who lacked it were expected to accept their place. It had been this way throughout human history too. Kings and emperors, corporations and governments, the strong taking from the weak and calling it order. But humanity had also learned something else. Systems built on domination always fell eventually. The oppressed always found their courage. The weak always discovered their strength. The question was never whether change would come, but how much suffering would happen before it did. She told the assembly that the Terran Confederation was offering a different path. Not conquest, not submission, but genuine partnership. A galaxy where species worked together because they chose to, not because they were forced to. Where trade was fair, where boundaries were respected, where diversity was celebrated rather than suppressed. Some species had already accepted this offer. More would follow. The Council could join them or oppose them, but it could not stop the change that was coming. She told them that the future was not written yet. It could be written in blood and fire, or it could be written in cooperation and mutual respect. The choice belonged to everyone in this room. Then she stepped down from the platform and walked out of the grand forum, leaving 200 species to consider her words in silence. 1 year had passed since Ambassador first said no to the Galactic Council. In that time, the galaxy had changed more than it had in the previous century. The old order was crumbling, but what replaced it was not chaos. It was something new. The Terran Coalition, as the growing alliance came to be known, now included 17 species. Some were major powers like the Federation. Others were smaller civilizations that had suffered under Council restrictions for generations. They came from different regions of the galaxy, spoke different languages, and had different cultures. What united them was a shared belief that the old way of doing things no longer served their interests. The Council still existed, but its authority had been fundamentally challenged. The Inner Circle met in emergency session almost daily, trying to develop strategies for containing the human threat. But every approach they tried seemed to make things worse. Military action was no longer viable. After Sigma Reach, 7 more species had announced they would join any defensive coalition against Council aggression. An attack on humanity would trigger a war that could last decades and might well destroy the Council itself. Economic pressure had failed. The alternative trade networks that humanity had established were growing stronger every month. Several Council member species had quietly begun using these networks themselves, preferring the better terms to official channels. Diplomatic isolation was impossible when more species wanted to join the coalition than remained loyal to the Council. High Arbiter sat alone in his private chambers, studying reports that told the same story from 100 different angles. The system he had spent his entire life serving was coming apart, not through conquest or destruction, but through something far more dangerous. People were simply choosing a different path. A chime announced a visitor, was surprised to see that it was Ambassador requesting a private meeting. After a moment of hesitation, he granted her entry. Entered the chamber with the same confident stride she had displayed in every encounter. She told that she had come to talk about the future, not the immediate future with its negotiations and treaties and political maneuvering. The long-term future, what kind of galaxy they wanted to leave for generations to come. Asked why she was having this conversation with him personally. He was the leader of the old order, the symbol of everything humanity had rejected. Surely there were others she would rather speak with. Sat down across from him, an informality that would have been unthinkable a year ago. She told him that the Terran Confederation did not seek the destruction of the Council. They did not want revenge for the years of condescension and restriction. They wanted change, but change did not require burning everything down. The High Arbiter had ruled the galaxy for 300 years. He understood power, diplomacy, and the complex relationships between species. That knowledge and experience was valuable. The question was whether he was willing to use it in service of a new vision, or whether he would cling to the old ways until they collapsed around him. Was quiet for a long time. He had been trained from birth to believe that the Council's way was the only way, that without strong central authority, the galaxy would descend into war and chaos. That species needed to be managed, controlled, guided by those wise enough to see the big picture. But the humans had proven that belief wrong. They had built alliances based on mutual respect. They had created economic partnerships that benefited all participants. They had offered friendship instead of demanding submission, and species had responded. Perhaps, he admitted slowly, perhaps the Council had been wrong. Not about everything. Order and cooperation were still important, but perhaps there were different ways to achieve them, ways that did not require one group to dominate all others. Nodded, she told him that humanity had struggled with the same questions throughout their history. They had tried empires and hegemonies and dominant powers. They had learned, painfully and repeatedly, that systems built on force eventually collapsed. The only sustainable order was one that people chose freely. She offered him a proposal. The Council could remain the center of galactic governance, but its structure would need to change. No more inner circle of privileged species. No more territorial mandates imposed from above. Instead, a genuine assembly where every member had equal standing and decisions were made through consensus rather than decree. The transition would be difficult. Many current council members would lose privileges they had enjoyed for centuries. But the alternative was watching their influence shrink year by year as more species joined the coalition. At least this way, they could help shape what came next. Considered the offer carefully. His political instincts told him to reject it, to fight for the system that had given his people power and wealth. But something deeper suggested that fighting was pointless. The humans had not just defeated the Council militarily and economically. They had defeated it ideologically. They had offered a better vision of what the galaxy could be. He told that he would need to consult with the other members of the inner circle. Some would resist. The especially had too much invested in the old order to give it up easily, but he would advocate for accepting her proposal. He would use whatever influence he had left to push for reform rather than confrontation. The negotiations that followed were the most difficult in galactic history. They lasted for months, with delegations arguing over every detail of the new structure. There were setbacks and crises and moments when it seemed the whole process would collapse. But eventually, an agreement was reached. The Galactic Council would be reformed along the lines had proposed. The old hierarchies would be dismantled. A new charter would guarantee equal representation for all member species, regardless of size or power. The signing ceremony was held in the Grand Forum where had delivered her challenge 1 year earlier. Representatives from every species in the galaxy attended. Some came with hope, others came with resignation, but they all came. Stood beside as the new charter was formalized. The High Arbiter had agreed to remain in his position during the transition period, his experience invaluable in guiding the complex process of reform. It was a partnership that would have seemed impossible just months before. After the ceremony, returned to her office and looked out at the alien skyline of Axiom Prime. Human ships moved through the traffic patterns overhead, no longer visitors in someone else's galaxy, but full participants in a community of equals. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, the fear and uncertainty of first contact, the humiliation of being treated as inferiors, the determination to build something better, the risks they had taken and the sacrifices they had made. Some would say humanity had been lucky. The right combination of circumstances, the right moment in galactic history, but knew it was more than luck. It was a choice, a refusal to accept that the future was determined by others, a belief that ordinary people working together could change the course of history. The galaxy was still full of challenges. Old prejudices did not disappear overnight. New conflicts would emerge. The hard work of building genuine partnership across species lines had only begun. But something fundamental had shifted. A small species from an unremarkable planet had looked at the established order and said no. They had refused to negotiate from weakness. They had refused to accept their assigned place. They had demanded to be treated as equals. And the galaxy had listened. In the years that followed, historians would debate exactly when the old order ended and the new one began. Some pointed to first refusal in the council chamber. Others chose the battle at Sigma Reach. Still others marked the signing of the Reformed Charter. But those who had lived through it knew the truth. The change had begun the moment humanity decided that the future was something to be created, not accepted. The moment they chose to reach for the stars not as supplicants but as explorers. The moment they refused to let anyone else define their limits. That was the real lesson of the human story, not their technology or their tactics or their rapid growth. The lesson was simpler and more profound. The future belongs to those who are brave enough to claim it.